Okay, we're continuing now with the prophecy. And the prophecy has to be made known far enough in advance to preclude the prophet from influencing the event or having knowledge from which the prophet could make a prediction. Next, it should be detailed enough to eliminate all possibility of it being a coincidence, guessing, or an analogy from past events. There must also be an exact fulfillment of the prophecy. Fulfilled prophecy is evidence of the divine origin of the Bible. God alone is able to predict future events with 100% accuracy. And we see that throughout the Bible. The first prophecy is in 710 BC. Micah promised that the Messiah would be born in Bethlehem. And 740 years later, we see that Jesus was born in Bethlehem, and see that in Matthew chapter 2, verse 1, and Luke chapter 2, verse 47. And then in 1015 BC or thereabouts, David prophesied that kings would bring gifts to the Lord, and that's in Psalms chapter 72, verse 10. This passage suggests that there would be 4 or more kings, but Christianity has held the number at 3 since there were 3 gifts. In addition, we have Isaiah, who prophesied around 740 BC that men would come forth showing the praise of the Lord, and that's in Isaiah chapter 60, verse 6. So that prophecy was fulfilled in about 2 BC in Matthew chapter 2, verse 11. The wise men followed the star in the east and brought gifts to the baby Jesus because they perceived Jesus to be a king. Then, somewhere between 790 and 710 BC, in the early days of the nation of Israel, Jesus was prophesied to be pulled out of Egypt, or called out of Egypt. And that was predicted by Hosea in Hosea chapter 11, verse 1. And this was fulfilled shortly after the visit of the wise men. We can see that Joseph and Mary, with the baby Jesus, went into Egypt from Judea. Then they were called out of Egypt. And that's in Matthew chapter 2, verses 13 through 15. In 740 BC, we see the coming of the Messiah to Zion. That's in Isaiah chapter 62, verse 11. And then around 33 AD, we find Matthew saying, "Behold, thy king cometh unto thee." Matthew chapter 21, verse 5 through 6. A prophecy of how God would offer one who would be a servant to all mankind and be salvation to everyone, but wanted to avoid attention. That was made around, 712 BC, and that's in Isaiah chapter 42, verses 1 through 2. And that was fulfilled 750 years later. We see in Matthew chapter 12, verses 14 through 16. And then the Messiah, it was prophesied, would reveal truths in parables, and that's in Psalm 78, verses 1 and 2. In 33 AD, we see this prediction fulfilled in Matthew chapter 13, verse 34, and Mark chapter 4, verses 33 through 34. The next prophecy was around 1000 BC, and it says the leaders would conspire to kill the Messiah, Jesus Christ. That's in Psalms chapter 2, verses 1 through 3. And that was fulfilled in 33 AD. Matthew 26, verses 2 and 4, and Luke 22, verses 1 and 2. And then it was said in Psalms chapter 22, verses 7 and 8, that people would heap scorn on the Messiah, Jesus Christ. And that was fulfilled in 33 AD in Matthew chapter 27, verses 39 through 44. Zechariah said the Messiah would enter Jerusalem on a donkey. And that's in Zechariah chapter 9, verse 9. And that was somewhere between 520 and 518 BC. That was fulfilled in 33 AD, about 33 AD, as we can see in Matthew chapter 21, verses 2 through 11, Mark 11, verses 2 through 11, Luke chapter 19, verses 34 through 37, and John chapter 12, verses 14 through 15. Then we find Isaiah in 713 BC telling us that the Messiah would perform miracles such as healing. And that's in Isaiah chapter 35, verses 5 through 6. And that was fulfilled 740 years later. And we see the fulfillment in Matthew chapter 15, verses 29 through 31, Mark chapter 7, verses 31 through 37, and Luke chapter 7, verses 20 through 22. Around 740 BC, Isaiah prophesied the virgin birth of Christ, the Messiah. And that was in Isaiah chapter 7, verse 14, and Isaiah chapter 9, verse 6. So around 2 BC, this was fulfilled at the birth of Jesus. His mother was Mary, a virgin, and he was named Emmanuel, which means God with us. And he was born a son and not a daughter. And that makes him the Son of God, which we can accurately say that he is God with us. Then around 1689 BC, Moses said the Messiah would come back or would come from the tribe of Judah. That's in Genesis 49, verse 10. And then the rod mentioned there was a common thing for a king, any king or ruler, and Shiloh refers to the Messiah. And that was fulfilled about 2 BC at the birth of Christ. Abraham was told the line of promise was through Isaac's son, Jacob. Jacob prophesied that his 12 sons would be the descendants of Judah and forever be the ones through whom the kingship would pass. And Jesus was from the tribe of Judah, as can be seen in Matthew chapter 1, and for Mary in Luke chapter 3, who was from the tribe of Judah. Then around 740 BC, another prophecy, Isaiah said that the Messiah would be preceded by a messenger. Isaiah chapter 40, verses 3 and 5. And then Malachi prophesied the same thing. And his was somewhere between 450 and 400 BC. And that was in Malachi chapter 3, verse 1. That was fulfilled 738 years later. And the true messenger was John the Baptist. And that's in Matthew 11, verses 10 through 11, Mark chapter 1, verse 2, Luke chapter 1, verse 76, and chapter 7, verse 27. And then David prophesied in about 1000 BC, there would be false witnesses against the Messiah in Psalms chapter 27, verse 12. This prophecy came true near the end of the life of Jesus Christ, as the chief priests, elders, and the council sought false witnesses against Jesus in order to put him to death. And that's in Matthew 26, verses 59 through 61, and Mark chapter 14, verses 55 through 57. But Jesus knew in advance that someone close to him, a trusted friend, would betray him. That's in Psalms 41, verse 9. And then Matthew tells us about this in Matthew chapter 26, verses 21 through 23. And John also tells us in John chapter 13, verses 18 through 19. Then around 712 to 587 BC, Isaiah and Ezekiel said that people would draw near to the Messiah, but their hearts were far from him. And that's in Isaiah 29, verse 3 or 13, and Ezekiel chapter 33, verse 31. And that was fulfilled around 33 AD when Christ explained that it was true in Matthew chapter 15, verses 7 through 9. It was also prophesied, it was also prophesied around 520 BC that the betrayal of the Messiah for 30 pieces of silver. That's in Zechariah chapter 11, verse 12. That was fulfilled around 33 AD when Judas betrayed Jesus for 30 pieces of silver. And you'll find that in Matthew chapter 26, verses 14 through 15. Then about 712 BC, it was prophesied that the Messiah would not open his mouth before his accusers. That's in Isaiah 53, verse 7. So about 10 years later, When Jesus, the Messiah, was asked, "Whence art thou?" and he gave no answer. That's in John chapter 19, verses 9 through 10. A prophecy by David about 1000 BC tells us that he would have his hands and feet pierced. That's in Psalms 22, verse 16. So about 1,000 years later, we see his hands and feet were pierced with nails, and is mentioned in all four Gospels: Matthew 27, verse 38, Mark 15, verse 27, Luke 23, verse 32, and John 19, verse 18. And in 712 BC or about, Isaiah said he would be numbered with said that Jesus would be numbered with the transgressors, and that's in Isaiah 53:12. And that was fulfilled when Jesus Christ was put to death with two thieves, one on his right and one on his left. And that's in Matthew chapter 27, verse 38, and Mark 15, verse 27. Then a prophecy of David in about 1000 BC said his garments, talking about Jesus, would be parted and they would cast lots on his vesture. It's in Psalms 22, verse 18. That was fulfilled 33 AD or about, as told by Matthew, Mark, and Luke. In Matthew 27, verse 35, Mark 15, verse 24, Luke 23, verse 34. And David prophesied also about 1000 BC that the bones of the Messiah would be broken. That's in Psalms 34:20. And in about 33 AD, we see the guards breaking the legs of the two thieves, but not those of Jesus. That's in John chapter 19, verses 32 through 33. It was prophesied in Psalms 69, verse 21, around 1000 BC, that he would be given vinegar to drink for his thirst. And John tells us about that in 33 AD in John chapter 19, verses 28 through 29. I hope you're seeing there's a few hundred years and some over 1,000 years between the prophecy and the fulfillment, and they were all fulfilled exact. In 712 BC, Isaiah prophesied that Jesus would be buried in a rich man's tomb. That's in Isaiah 53, verse 9. And in 33 AD, we see that fulfillment in Matthew 27, verses 57 through 60. And it was prophesied in about 712 BC that Jesus would offer himself as a ransom and die for mankind's sin. And that was fulfilled in about 33 AD, with Matthew telling us that Jesus came to minister and to give his life as a ransom for many. It's in Matthew chapter 20, verse 28. And then Zechariah tells us about 730 years before it happened that Jesus would be pierced. And that's in Zechariah chapter 12, verse 10. And in John chapter 19, verse 34, we have John telling us about the fulfillment. The people sitting and staring was foretold in Psalms chapter 22, verse 17. That was fulfilled in Matthew chapter 27, verse 36. And that is all on those particular type prophecies. Thank you for listening.